Welcome to On Our Watch, a podcast about coastal erosion and sustainability in Louisiana. My name is Marian Evans. I'm a filmmaker and a producer of the documentary On Our Watch, a feature-length film that examines Louisiana's coastal land loss crisis and the ways in which it impacts our communities, industries, and culture. The film's director, Jonathan Evans, and I are proud to produce this podcast series that will continue to explore issues facing the Louisiana coast through conversations with local residents, community leaders, and experts. In this episode, we're speaking with Dr. Reggie Ferreira. Reggie is the program director of the Disaster Resilience Leadership Academy at Tulane University, as well as an associate professor of social work. And now, our interview with Dr. Reggie Ferreira. Well, thank you for joining us today, Reggie.
Of course. Thank you for the opportunity.
Of course. So I wanted to start by asking you about how you got into the disaster resilience field and why you were drawn to studying it in the first place.
Yeah, so that's actually a great question and very interesting question. I'm a third generation social worker from South Africa. I grew up on a farm setting, so I've always been fairly close to nature. And then I guess the apple didn't fall far from the tree. My mother actually was a researcher who recently retired, and her research focused on resilience and trauma, and it's just always piqued my interest. And also wanted to travel internationally, and just was drawn to the nature element. And as a kid, would sit outside, always drive my mom crazy, with lightning storms. Where I grew up in South Africa, we have lightning storms, so just always intrigued by the force of nature. So I guess it just, with my mom's background and then the nature aspect, it really fused.
Yeah, very cool. And so you're the director of the Disaster Resilience Leadership Academy here at Tulane. So can you tell me a little bit about what that program entails and what students can hope to learn from going through it?
Yes, yeah. So we actually started as a result of Hurricane Katrina. Nancy Mock Kilu and Charles Figley came together and put their brain powers together and created the academy with the idea that there's always a void, not always, but there's often a void in disasters, when it comes to leadership, with informed decision making. So the academy was birthed in 2009. The academic program started 2010, around about 2010, with a graduate certificate, and that evolved into a Master's of Science in Disaster Resilience Leadership. That's interdisciplinary in nature, so it really focuses on all aspects. The human and social factor, leadership, economics of disaster, the environment and infrastructure, because when we do experience disaster, oftentimes most sectors, if not all sectors, are impacted by disaster. So that's it really in a nutshell. But what students can expect, we've had roughly 26 different undergraduate disciplines come through the program, again, just with the interdisciplinary nature of the program itself. And our alumni ends up in quite a variety of job placements. We have someone who's working for Nike as their global resilience lead. We have some of our alumni working for Team Rubicon, the veteran services organization. Then we have folks working for local mental health providers, just given the impact of disaster, so they focus on disaster mental health. And then we have several of our students working abroad as well, assisting with humanitarian related aspects.
Wow, awesome. Seems like a very broad
spectrum. It is very broad, yes. Yeah.
And so I know you're also the founder and executive director for the Consortium for Equitable Disaster Resilience.
Yes.
And so can you tell me a little bit about the work you're doing there and what kinds of local organizations you're partnering with?
Yeah, so we obviously experienced Hurricane Ida. And the impacts were pretty significant. And just, through my research the past 15 years, one thing I've always been interested in is resource allocation and how people actually access resources post-disaster. So we received generous funding from the Walmart Foundation that actually allowed us then to create the Consortium for Equitable Disaster Resilience, where the idea was really to research what are the barriers marginalized communities face in accessing disaster financing and resources. We know the funding is available, it is there, but oftentimes our marginalized communities are just not able to access these pots of funding, due to several barriers And we've actually partnered with 8 grassroots organizations in Louisiana that were impacted by IDA that are either BIPOC-led or serve BIPOC populations in Louisiana. So yeah, it's been really great working with them throughout this process. So they actually were able to apply to us, and we had a re-granting program. They pitched an idea to us, and we actually took that proposal that they submitted to us, and we've now helped them develop into something bigger, but they've also worked on building out their projects. And the projects really range from mental health services for communities. So we have one group working out along the river parishes, providing mental health services to folks impacted by IDA and other disasters, and also some of the environmental justice issues out in the river parishes. We've had a lot of rebuilding happening as well. And then we have some green infrastructure focused groups as well. Yeah, so it's really, again, you know, it's a spectrum of folks. But the idea is really to get resources to the most vulnerable at the end of the day.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think is unique about Louisiana and this region in terms of disaster resilience? And how does that compare to the other parts of the world that you've studied?
Yeah, so there is a very uniqueness. I mean, we are at a very high risk of experiencing hazards and disasters in general. And then linked with that, we also have a lot of social vulnerability, you know, through historical marginalization of populations over time. You know, so that just makes it a perfect mix, you know, of experiencing like these epic disasters that we experience here in Louisiana in general. But what makes us unique here when it comes to resilience, I think there's a disaster subculture. You know, people have been able to adapt, not everyone, because, you know, we all don't have equal resources. But yeah, there's stories of resilience across, you know, if I just take some of our folks who got awarded through our re-granting process, you know, the one individual lost their house with Hurricane Katrina and they lost their house again with Ida, but they want to stay. You know, there's this notion, you know, we all need to pack up and move out, but people are rooted to the soil here. I do think that is really something different. I'm not saying that doesn't happen in other places in the world, but there's just a connectedness to the soil and the water here in Louisiana. I think that does make it unique, and people's adaptability in general, you know. So there's really no other place for me when it comes to resilience than what we experience here in Louisiana. There's something very, very unique.
Yeah, I agree. So I was wondering if you could speak to the importance of focusing on mental health within disaster resilience, and what role do you think mental health plays in a community's ability to recover from disaster?
Yeah, I'm actually very excited that you're mentioning this because we don't talk enough about mental health in general. You know, everyday life without, let's put disaster aside for a second, you know, is already stressful, you know, with family stress, work stress, you know, the economy, economic stress. And then when we add in disaster to that, you know, that just compounds aspects. And also there's not enough mental health services, unfortunately, available, or people are sometimes hesitant to seek mental health services. So it's very important, and it's one of the elements of being resilient within a disaster context is having that mental capacity. There's a lot of research actually coming out stating that you need to anticipate, if you live in an area like Louisiana, you need to anticipate that there's disaster going to happen at some stage. That's just building out that mental capacity. So in general, I would say it's super important. We need to talk more about it and also ensure again that we allocate resources for mental health services, not just after a disaster, but pre-disaster as well. It's very, very important. And then the aspect of climate change, you know, it's an area that I'm trying to look at, climate change and mental health. We still don't know enough. I'm not exactly sure about the exact statistics, but I believe Louisiana now had the second longest heat wave this past year in the world. You know, so just how that plays in on people's behavior, the impact on the economy, and just our general way of life really compounds in the long run. And we want a healthy society at the end of the day.
Yeah, right. What do you think are some of the most important qualities that you look for, or you like to instill in your students as they train to become future leaders of disaster resilience?
Yes, that's a great question. At the end of the day, empathy is probably the most important for me, that I would like a student to walk away with or a graduate to walk away with. and also have an understanding. Not that I'm saying you need to put yourself in that individually experienced disaster shoes, but just have empathy and have respect, and also not like parachute into a community. We often see it so many times here in Louisiana, especially from a research standpoint. Folks from the outside will come into the community, they'll extract information and never take the information back to the community. So yeah, I would say empathy is important. Being culturally sensitive to the community you work in is probably two of the most important things. And then everything else sort of falls in place, because then you're able to build relationships with people in general.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. Getting into the community and actually hearing what their needs are.
Yeah, and building up
huge.
trust is also important. These things take time to cultivate these relationships. It's also important that we build these relationships before a disaster and not wait to do it after a disaster. That's oftentimes when disaster programming fails as well, is there's no buy-in from the community because the community has either been burnt in the past or their trust has been broken. So it's very important to focus on building the relationships beforehand.
Right, so you have that trust to begin with. Awesome. What are some of your key takeaways that you found from your research about how communities can be better able to adapt to and cope with disasters? What are the main factors?
So there's sort of three levels to your question. On individual level, it's definitely, just in terms of adapting and being resilient in the face of disaster, is just to have gratitude for what you have, then building that out. Having something like humor, and also accepting sort of that this is just temporary. But, again, from individual to individual, this varies. But, I would sort of point that out as the three main ones for me. On the individual level, on the household family level, it's really building cohesion and also understanding one another's quirks and, that one family member can step up for the other family member if something was to happen. And then on the community level, it's definitely social cohesion. And across all three of the levels I mentioned is also building in a preparedness culture. Again, anticipating that you live in an area that's going to experience a disaster, not a question of if, but when. So definitely the preparedness piece will allow for adaptation. But again, it's gradual steps. It's not just going to happen overnight. But again, there's something about folks in Louisiana. If we take with what happened with Hurricane Ida, we unfortunately had one death, and I believe it was non-hurricane related, was related to an alligator attack. And then actually Ida moved up northeast, and we unfortunately had several people drown in their basements in the northeast. So there is something to be said about Louisiana and our disaster subculture that could actually be emulated across the country. In general, so yeah. Do you have any future projects on the horizon that you're looking forward to, either with your students or with your research? Definitely, yes. One of our current projects we're sort of proposing is actually looking at how people access resources. So we looked at what are the barriers, but how do people access resources, and also focusing on the positive, what's working. That doesn't mean we shouldn't address what's not working, but let's bring to the forefront aspects that are working, and this is all within the context of resilience programming, preparedness programming. Then another project that's actually currently busy with is in my native South Africa, is focusing on equitable disaster resilience, really conceptualizing it from an African perspective. And hopefully we can emulate that here in Louisiana as well. It's important to give communities the voice that they can conceptualize concepts instead of academics or policymakers coming in and enforcing something down on the community. So yeah, those are just some of the things I'm super excited about. Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today, Reggie. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you for listening to On Our Watch. We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Dr. Reggie Ferreira. Don't forget to subscribe to On Our Watch on your favorite podcast app to be notified about future episodes. You can also watch a video version of this podcast on YouTube, which you can find a link to in the description. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll be back with another episode next week. This podcast is made possible through grant funds from the Greater New Orleans Foundation and executive produced by Bruno UK Steiner.